The EU Commission has angered a lot of gamers and supporters of the Stop Killing Games movement, and rightly so. With nearly 1.3 million people backing the initiative, we were hopeful to see a positive change from the Commission. Although I'm a huge supporter of the movement and its overall message, I was not surprised by the Commission's decision. In fact, I believe the movement faces several significant legal strategic challenges that have not been fully addressed. This video will look at why the Commission reached the decision it did, why I believe the movement may be facing some major legal obstacles in the future, and provide what I hope is an unbiased and objective legal overview of the situation. The purpose of this video is not to attack the movement or undermine its goals, as I myself am a supporter of it. Rather, it's to encourage discussion about how its arguments can be strengthened moving forward. If the movement wants to succeed, these issues need to be confronted directly. And as always, this isn't legal advice. On June 16th, the European Commission rejected the core request of the Stop Killing Games initiative and declined to propose new legislation requiring publishers to keep games playable after commercial support ends. Instead, it indicated that it would pursue a voluntary industry code of conduct and continue relying on existing consumer protection frameworks, which were solutions considered as a loss to what the initiative proposed. SKG's central proposal was straightforward. When consumers purchase a game, publishers should not be able to render that game completely unusable by shutting down servers or ending support. The movement argues that this practice undermines consumer rights. The movement therefore sought legal requirements that would ensure games remain functional in some form after official support ends. Importantly, SKG has consistently maintained that its position is focused on consumer rights rather than intellectual property. At its core, this debate is not just about consumer rights. It's about ownership and control of intellectual property. I understand that Ross and the movement have repeatedly stated that IP is not what they're trying to challenge. However, simply stating that does not remove IP from the discussion. The moment we begin discussing permanent access to games after support ends, we are discussing how IP can continue to be used, distributed, modified, or accessed. Games are made up of copyrighted software, artwork, music, trademarks, licensed content, and in many cases third-party agreements. Unlike physical products purchased decades ago, modern games are typically sold under license agreements rather than through outright ownership. At a fundamental level, because we are sold a license to access the game and not full ownership, they own the IP right to these games. And with that IP right, they have the right to terminate the game. From the Commission's perspective, any preservation requirement would therefore affect rights that copyright and IP laws are specifically designed to protect. The Commission stated under copyright law, right holders are entitled to establish the conditions for the licensed use of their video games, including the condition for the termination of the license. Whether people agree to that position or not, it reflects the current legal framework. And this makes sense because under existing IP laws, it's extremely difficult for the government to compel an IP holder to make its IP available. There is an archival exception, but archiving games for preservation is not the same as letting people play it indefinitely, which is what SKG wanted. I wanted to raise this issue first because at the heart of it, this is the biggest roadblock to this movement. With further IP issues in relation to trademarks, design, trade secrets, and third-party licensing agreements, the key question has always been, how do you preserve access to games without undermining existing IP rights? That is the question critics, policymakers, and industry groups have consistently raised. In my opinion, this is where SKG's strategy has been at its weakest. The movement has intentionally kept its proposals broad and flexible, arguing that lawmakers and industry stakeholders should determine the legal framework. There is logic behind that approach. A simple message is easier to communicate and easier for the public to support. However, vagueness can become a weakness if it leaves major legal questions unanswered. It effectively provides opponents and lobbyists with an opportunity to determine the legal challenges before the movement defines the solutions. And I believe that is exactly what happened here. I think SKG would have benefited from putting forward more concrete and updated proposals regarding how IP concerns could be addressed, or at least recognize them more directly in discussing possible compromises. Leaving that entirely to policymakers and industry stakeholders was always going to be risky, especially when the issue considers reframing ownership. The annex submitted by SKG states, this practice challenges the concept of ownership itself, where the customer is left with nothing after buying a game. It also states this practice deprives European citizens of their property by making it so that they lose access to their product an arbitrary amount of time after the point of sale. Those are powerful arguments. However, once we begin discussing ownership, property rights, and what consumers should retain after purchase, questions about IP and ownership become unavoidable. The movement therefore needed to be prepared to engage with those concerns directly, which it didn't do too well. Furthermore, Ross has stated that the movement had indications for nearly a year that the Commission was unlikely to pursue new legislation. There were leaked emails, industry lobbying efforts, closed meetings, and increasing signs that resistance was building. If that was the expectation, I believe the movement could have spent more time refining its legal arguments and adapting its strategy accordingly. When I watched Ross's recent response video, it sometimes felt as though the possibility of rejection had been accepted too readily. Personally, I think the movement still had the opportunity to push harder. With nearly 1.3 million signatures supporting the initiative, there was considerable political momentum available. That momentum could potentially have been used to seek further discussions, propose more detailed legal frameworks, engage directly with policymakers, or present alternative solutions that address the Commission's concerns. I appreciate that this may sound critical, but I am approaching this issue from a legal perspective. Law is rarely black and white, 99% of it operates in grey areas. So compromises, negotiations, and balancing interests between various parties is very, very important. That's especially true when consumer rights and IP rights collide. For that reason, I believe the movement needs to continually refine its position and ensure that its arguments are capable and withstanding the scrutiny they will inevitably face. Now, this isn't something that could be easily done, especially by Ross and his team who lack real legal expertise on the matter. They need to desperately consult with a legal IP firm and really strengthen their proposals and offer a better legal framework, one that considers all IP rights. As things stand, I believe the Commission's concerns regarding intellectual property were never fully resolved, and therefore their references for rejecting to propose new laws due to IP were correct. It's not a conclusion I agree with morally given my own bias for game preservation, but from a legal perspective I can understand why the Commission reached it. There is another legal issue raised by the Commission that I believe deserves clarity on. The Commission stated, quote, an obligation for publishers to sell or license video games to consumers in the EU to keep them in a playable state as requested by the ECI would not be proportionate. That is a crucial point because proportionality is one of the core principles of EU law. The Commission can fully agree that consumers are harmed when games become inaccessible and still conclude that the proposed solution goes further than is legally necessary. The question is whether a legal obligation requiring games to remain playable after support ends is proportionate when applied across the entire industry. Video games are not a single category of product, which the movement has vaguely stated. A small indie multiplayer game with a handful of developers is not the same as a major MMO with millions of players. A game that relies on third-party cloud servers, anti-cheat systems, licensed music, or external infrastructure faces very different challenges from a simple indie title. Yet the obligation proposed by SKG would need to work for all of them. The Commission therefore has to ask whether imposing a universal legal obligation on every publisher is the least restrictive way of achieving the objective. For example, what happens if a developer goes bankrupt? What happens if critical server infrastructure is provided by a third party? What happens if continuing support creates security vulnerabilities? What happens if licensed content can no longer legally be distributed? What happens if compliance costs are manageable for Ubisoft but devastating for a small independent studio? These are not necessarily arguments against preservation, they are proportionality concerns. A regulator is required to consider whether the burden imposed by a law is justified by the benefit it provides. This is why I believe SKG has another strategic weakness. The movement has done an excellent job demonstrating the harm suffered by consumers. What it has spent less time doing is demonstrating why its preferred remedy is proportionate across the entire industry, failing to demonstrate why a universal legal obligation is the most appropriate solution. This is why it's so important to be specific about what you want. Stop killing games is a fantastic simple slogan, but the law needs to define what games and how. And to do that legally is an incredibly difficult task. And until the question is answered, the Commission is likely to continue viewing the proposal as disproportionate regardless of which legislative route the movement pursues. So let's look at what the future strategy is for the movement. Following the Commission's decision, Stop Killing Games has stated that it intends to focus on implementing their proposals by trying to amend the Digital Fairness Act through EU Parliament. This route may offer greater political flexibility as members of the European Parliament can propose and support amendments during the legislative process, and the Parliament has at times shown greater openness to consumer rights framing of digital issues than the Commission, with Ross himself showing a letter of support they had more members of European Parliament in favour than not. However, this does not remove the underlying structural constraints of EU lawmaking. The Digital Fairness Act is a broad consumer protection initiative focused on issues such as dark patterns, unfair commercial practices, and manipulative digital design. These are high-priority mass-market consumer concerns with strong institutional backing. By contrast, SKG's proposals raise a separate and more legally complex set of questions relating to IP, licensing, and contractual access rights. Although game preservation can be framed within consumer protection, once it enters the legislative process, the debate once again returns to IP. As a result, shifting the debate into the Digital Fairness Act does not bypass the Commission's concerns so much as relocate them into the co-decision phase, where similar legal questions will need to be resolved collectively. To understand that, you need to understand how the EU system is structured. The European Commission has the exclusive right to propose most new EU legislation. The European Parliament and the Council of the European Union then act as co-legislators, negotiating, amending and ultimately adopting legislation. As a result, even if the EU Parliament were supportive of the proposal, the same legal hurdles identified by the Commission would still need to be addressed during the legislative process. Questions surrounding IP, licensing, proportionality, implementation, and legal compatibility would not simply disappear because one institution supported the initiative. Parliamentary support alone does not resolve the underlying legal issues. Those members are not legal experts. Those concerns would still need to be answered before any proposal could realistically progress into EU law. But I do recognise it is currently their only option within the EU. Losing the Commission's approval has been a huge blow to the movement, so I don't blame Ross and the team for trying this new method, but it'd be incredibly naive to think this will be an easy route again. Despite all of these criticisms, I want to be absolutely clear about something. Stop Killing Games has successfully highlighted a genuine problem. Ross and the wider movement deserve significant credit for bringing this issue into mainstream discussion. Reaching over 1 million signatures and forcing institutions to engage with the topic is a remarkable achievement in itself. Even if no legislation is ultimately passed, the movement has already changed the conversation. Developers and publishers are now far more aware of consumer concerns regarding ownership and preservation than they were only a few years ago. We have seen similar shifts before. Public pressure helped push predatory loot boxes out of mainstream titles, and it's entirely possible that game preservation follows a similar trajectory. The Commission's proposed code of conduct may also encourage industry-wide improvements even without new legislation. We've already seen examples of publishers introducing end-of-life plans that would have been unlikely a decade ago. That progress should not be ignored. The challenge facing SKG is that the preferred solutions continue to collide with one of the most heavily protected areas of European law, intellectual property, and their solutions are not proportionate to the industry. That reality cannot simply be dismissed. Unless the movement develops a framework that more clearly balances consumer rights with copyright and licensing concerns, it is likely to encounter many of the same obstacles regardless of which legislative route it pursues. The Commission's decision should not be viewed as the end of the road. Instead, it should be viewed as a wake-up call and opportunity to better their strategy, an opportunity to strengthen the legal arguments, refine the proposals, address the unanswered questions, and build a strategy capable of surviving legal scrutiny that lies ahead. If the movement can do that, its chances of achieving meaningful legal change will be significantly stronger. If Stop Killing Games continues pursuing an all-or-nothing approach, it risks spending years fighting the same legal battles in different forums to no prevail. I am Oro, a paralegal with experience in IP law and litigation here in the UK. I appreciate that some people will be hurt by the EU Commission's decision, so let me know your thoughts on the issue in the comments. I believe the movement is raising an important issue and I genuinely want to see it succeed. My concern is simply that some of the legal obstacles facing the movement are being underestimated, and that optimism alone is not a substitute for legal preparation. If Ross or anyone involved with the movement happens to see this, I would genuinely welcome a discussion on these issues. Because if the goal is to achieve lasting legal change, then identifying weaknesses in the strategy today may ultimately help strengthen the movement tomorrow. If you want to continue supporting the movement, then I encourage all EU members to continue writing to your members of European Parliament. Be vocal, but ensure you are informed and diplomatic, and let them know why you disagree with the decision. For Californian viewers, there is currently a bill being pushed in your state. Link to that and how you can help in the description. Thank you for watching.